even in Europe today, where there's much higher carbon pricing in Europe than there are in North America, most of that goes to the balancing of a budget. And it's not going into the investing and advancing green technologies. It's not. It's some of it's going back to a redistribution, but not enough. If we're going to properly do carbon pricing as a world, we need to think about what are the priorities. Okay, should the proceeds of the carbon tax go into all green energy and advancing the technology faster, so we could have a breakthrough? We could have a breakthrough in new technologies that bring down the green premium. So, so the curve is not just like this. We have a new breakthrough and it goes up. And that's what we need. And that's, to me, what is necessary. I'm a big believer in the need of a carbon pricing vehicle. At the same time, it is hard to administrate. It's hard to making sure it's fair and just. And you're never going to see that pricing in the global setting with the emerging world. Getting back to the first question again. And so we need to be thoughtful about how we execute it. But there's no question a carbon tax would mitigate demand. And but to me, the other side of the equation is what are we doing with the revenues, and should all the revenues go into the advancement of new technologies rapidly? And we saw how capitalism worked related to, and public-private worked related to a vaccination for COVID. Okay, we have to have the same intensity than we did in COVID, and we're going to have those breakthroughs, but it requires a lot of public investing alongside private investing, and I don't see that happening enough.
Very good. Well, I know you've said the next 1,000 unicorns are all going to be in climate tech, so I'm looking for those unicorns myself,
we are
personally.
Too. Personally?
No, I'm joking.
Okay, good.
Very good.
I will pick it up there. Mr. Fink, I just want to go a little bit deeper into how you think about oil and gas companies. I mean, you've talked about how there is so much focus on the supply side, not enough on the demand side. We've seen oil and gas companies targeted by activist investors with short-term ambitions when they try to focus on sustainability. What do you think is the right approach for companies in these hard-to-abate sectors?
Once again, we need to be thoughtful about the long-term process of how much supply do we need in a decarbonizing world. We need to map out properly how much oil and gas we are going to need so we have a just transition at the same time creating the new technologies. In many cases, new investments, if you have a 40-year break-even, they're not going to be good investments. They're going to be stranded. But in the short run, there are going to be many opportunities where you're going to have to do this. If we only focus on public energy companies, on reducing their exploration and R&D, let's step back for a second. The average well is depleted 6% a year. So if there's no investments, their production is down 6% a year on average. And so what we're doing then, shifting more demand. If we don't change the demand curve, it's shifting more of the supply than from Russia to Iran and Saudi Arabia. And that's what's happening right now. The Western hydrocarbon companies of Europe and North America have underinvested because some of the pressure. Some of it's underinvested because oil was too cheap, and it was a bad return for some of them. So it's a combination of both. But we have to ask these questions. If we're going to be still dependent on gas, still dependent on oil for a certain period of time, we need to be thoughtful in talking about that. And we need to be thoughtful about that and how we work with our hydrocarbon companies instead of asking a Gulf country to raise their production. That doesn't change the net zero world at all. It just provides more wealth in a few countries, and it harms our companies. The key for our hydrocarbon companies, they need to rapidly move towards a more decarbonized business model, but at the same time, they are the number one purveyor of energy, of gas and oil, in a society that still is totally dependent on that. And we solve so many of the issues around electricity already with wind and solar, but we need to be much more thoughtful of how to rapidly build green and blue hydrogen as a great substitute. And we're not seeing enough money being spent there. So Our job as a large shareholder of these companies is working with them, not against them. We're not against them exploring as an investor. We're not against them building new capacity, but we want to understand that in their decarbonized path. So it's not black or white. There can be various degrees. If they could show that they could be investing today with a break-even that's very rapid because it's not a costly place to extract hydrocarbons, that will be fine. But we need to also, I've been saying this very loudly too. I don't believe in hydrocarbon companies disposing of their assets, because that goes from public to private. I would like the world to embrace this concept of good bank, bad bank, which I've talked about at a G20 meeting, whereby the hydrocarbon companies spin off a portion of their hydrocarbon businesses into a declining trust. They commit 100% of the proceeds goes into green. So they rapidly expand their green, but they still have the business model of managing their IO stream downward, the hydrocarbons, and it's very public, it's transparent. We need to create these types of vehicles like we've done during financial crisis with banks. We need to create new vehicles, new thought process, not unlike what I said, how we have to reimagine the IMF and the World Bank. We need to reimagine how we could rapidly deploy new capital into the greening of the world and a decarbonized world, but not the avoidance of hydrocarbons in the short run, or we're going to have $120, $140 oil. And that's not a fair and just transition. And that's what we're witnessing right now. And as I said, if you're really truly trying to get a green transition, why politically do you put caps on energy and heating into a winter? It tells you the political realities, how to navigate this. It's not binary, it's very granular. And we have to be thoughtful about how do we take finance, and this is what G-Finance is about, how do we take finance, all the ideas that we have in finance all the years, whether it's a good bank, bad bank, senior subordinated, how do we take those different processes, those different ways of financing, and apply that to a decarbonizing world?
Where does the onus of responsibility lie to drive those initiatives that you just talked about, reimagining the way finance flows? It feels as though right now finance is actually getting ahead of regulators, getting ahead of governments. But does there need to be guidance coming from the top? This
would be more accelerated if we had more multilateralism like this COP today, more conversations of doing it together. You framed it correctly. In many cases, the private sector is moving more rapidly. Let me say public companies of the private sector are moving more rapidly than parts of society, and it's leading to more polarization. More polarization. Some parts of America believe we shouldn't be, we should be drilling more. Some parts of America believes we should be greening more. The reality is, the pathway is not going to be from brown to green. The pathway is going to be from dark brown to medium brown to light brown to very lightest shades of green to medium green to green. It is a process, and that requires planning, or we're going to have this imbalance and this unfairness. If we want to create a platform, we have to be thoughtful about how we move forward by not the abandonment, not the underinvestment, if it makes sense in the short run, but to be thoughtful about how can we mix the use of hydrocarbons. For example, we should be rapidly moving away from coal in the emerging world, maybe in the short run to natural gas. I mean, we have to find different ways of mitigation of CO2s. And as I said, it's not going to be from brown to green. There's going to have to be intermediate ways of getting there without creating a real major economic burden on the emerging world.
Well, thank you so much to you both for this opening conversation. Plenty of food for thought as I open it up to our wider panel now. So let me put the first question to Jose. Thank you for joining us. What is your take on the question of how we can mobilize investment into emerging and developing economies, picking up where Larry left off?
Well, thank you very much. And I think that Larry already said very important things. And I think that there is a need to really mobilize very, very substantial amounts of capital. And the problem is that during the pandemic, what we have had is to increase the sustainable capital gap between advanced economies on the one hand and emerging markets and developing economies. So the situation has gone from bad to worse, and we need to redress the situation very quickly. And I think that the key has to do with the collaboration between the private and the public sector. And just to put a name to what Larry was talking about, which I think is the key, is blended finance. And we need to think of how can we rethink the role of multilaterals so that they can crowd in a much, much bigger amount of private money than they have. So I think that's critical. And there are innovative financial solutions, like creating platforms that ideally could help the multilaterals to co-invest with institutional investors. And there are now attempts in place to develop the frameworks which, from the financial and the legal point of view, provide the right incentives for the multilaterals to invest so that they can lend in line with their mandates without jeopardizing the rating, while at the same time providing adequate risk-adjusted returns to investors. This is something we're working on, for example, through the United Nations Alliance of Global Investors for Sustainable Development, which a number of institutions here are members of, and I think it's very, very critical. Another thing which is very important is make sure that there is transparency in terms of information. I think that investors need to understand better what is the pipeline of sustainable projects which exist. Again, there are initiatives in terms of investor platforms which are making this possible in terms of correcting this asymmetry of information and having supply and demand much, much better. But I think there is also a very important thing. I think that in emerging markets and developing economies, they have to play their part as well in several respects. One is identifying what are sustainable projects. I think it's very important that there is this identification. This may require technical assistance. Multilaterals can also help countries in providing the technical know-how which is needed to identify sustainable projects. And then those projects need to be made bankable. And again, that requires collaboration between the private sector, private financial institutions, global banks like Standard Chartered and others, with multilaterals to identify the risk, the projects, and make them bankable. And again, that's blended finance. So I come back to where I started. And governance. When you ask international investors, why don't you invest in this or that project? Many of them say, well, I have concerns about the governance of these projects, sustainable projects. So I think that emerging markets and developing economies still need to do a lot in a number of cases to enhance their institutions, the governance, so that this removes another layer of discomfort for international investors. But I think that the solution is within reach. I think that the private sector is moving. There is a clear, conscious of not just the moral imperative, but the commercial opportunities which are behind, that capital shift to emerging markets and developing economies to promote sustainable development and to fight climate change in particular. And I hope and expect that we will be able to provide the solutions with the right amounts of capital at pace and at scale.
It does feel like, walking around the summit over the last couple of days, that the conversation is changing away from talking about climate change as a cost burden and toward thinking about it like an opportunity. Alison, I want to come to you. It feels as though, based on all these conversations with institutional investors and corporate leaders, that the money is there. But how do we actually get that money into the economy and get it working to fuel the transition? What are the sort of practical barriers that you think are important to highlight?
Yeah, and I think the really important point you make there is the money is there. I mean, the work of GFANZ, you've seen incredible collaboration and coming together across the whole finance sector, asset managers and insurance sectors and banks, and there is a huge amount of money and commitment to fund and finance this transition. We are getting ahead of the public sector. What we need are really clear signals from government and policymakers to accelerate the deployment of that capital, and I think that's the really important point. We're actually getting on and doing it and funding the transition. But in the way we've talked about as well, this is going to be a transition, and one thing that is front of mind is making sure it is a just transition. And there is real opportunity here in closing that gap and making sure that we can close the green premium and make it affordable so that low carbon projects are being financed is really critical. One of the things that we've been focused on at NatWest is thinking about SMEs. They're a critical part of the global economy. In the UK, for example, they represent 50% of the revenue, 60% of the employees, and 30% of the emissions. So they have a really vital role to play in getting to net zero. And when you look at the opportunities in front of them, when I look at the projects and the research that we've done, there's 160 billion revenue opportunities. So if you're a business owner, the money is there, the opportunity is there. What we need to do is move into practical steps, really practical help, putting in the hands of small businesses, of private companies, the tools, the access to capital to finance these sustainable projects so that we can transition. Because the last thing we want as we come out of this huge amount of money, real focus is that we end up with a dislocation in developed economies, developing economies, in parts of society who cannot afford or can make the differential or understanding between what 1.5 degrees means and what I can do as an individual business owner. So I think very simply the money is there. There's real collaboration across the finance sector. We need clear signals from government and policy owners, and we need to close the gap in pricing and put practical steps in the hands of the people who are going to make this change.
David, I see you nodding along, so let me come to you next. What difference would having international sustainability standards make?
So what we're talking about here is a massive change in terms of how investors allocate capital. And it's a huge transformation. We've had a global economy that's been reliant on fossil fuels for 200 plus years. We're trying to change this over the course of the next 10, 20 years. So dramatic transformation. The question is, how do you do that? How do investors have access to the data and the information, the analysis, to make that kind of transition in a smart way and in a way that's effective? And then if you look at it from the issuer side, how do you, as a company that's looking to address your own needs and attract capital, how do you figure out how to disclose or provide the right information that's going to attract that capital? So the global economy has to go through this massive transition, and we need a new architecture. We need a new playbook. We need new rules as to how to do it. And we've made terrific progress in this area in a number of ways. TCFD is a great framework for disclosure in terms of companies using that framework, and it's a start in terms of providing information on how climate change, how climate risk affects your strategy, how do you manage the risks associated with it, what are the metrics you use, and then, of course, how do you govern associated with it, what kind of governance you have. But it's only a start. And so to your question, what the IFRS Foundation is doing and the International Financial Sustainability Board, this is a real opportunity to create a new rule set in the same way that we have accounting standards, to have new standards, new rules for companies to address their climate issues and their climate risks, and then for investors to look at that data and use that in terms of making their investment decisions. So one part of the puzzle. There's more to do. I think we're also making good progress in terms of taxonomies, which are really important in terms of having comparable data on a global basis. If there's an auto company in China that's using steel and an auto company in Germany that's using steel, how do you evaluate the greenness of that steel in each of those manufacturers? The good news is that the different markets around the world, different countries and regulators are talking about aligning these taxonomies. And I think to the extent we can go down this path with the Sustainability Board and the associated standards there, with taxonomies that are aligned on a global basis, we can make real progress in this area.
Andy, let me come to you. The insurance, long-term savings industry can play obviously a major role in tackling climate change through the choices you make around your long-term investments. But how do you ensure that the actions that you take will actually create the change you want to see in the real economy?
Yeah, so going back to your previous point, Julianna, I absolutely see this as an opportunity. We've worked out that it will cost about £2.7 trillion over the next 15 years to achieve the UK's net zero goal. The long-term savings and retirement sector can fund about a third of that, about £0.9 trillion or 60 billion a year. We're doing a fair amount at the moment, but nothing like at that level. So the first thing I'd say is all of us as asset owners, we need to think about doing three things. Firstly, we need to set really clear targets that we're held accountable to, and I think the clarity disclosures around that and consistency of that is key. So at Phoenix Group, we're the UK's largest long-term savings and retirement business. We invest £300 billion on behalf of 13 million customers. So we've committed, obviously, to net zero by 2050 for all that £300 billion. We've then taken the $250 billion of that where we have a mandate. We have a mandate from our customers. We've committed to halve the carbon emissions from that by 2030. That's equivalent to the carbon output of a quarter of the homes, so 6 million homes in the UK. So that gives you a sense of the scale of difference we can make. And then we've also committed that the 160 billion of that 250 billion that is listed equity and debt, that we will reduce that by 25% by 2025. Because I guess as a CEO committing to 2050, I doubt I'll still be doing the job at 2050. I quite enjoy it, but 2025, 2030, quite possibly. And I'm held to account against those targets. So that's the first step. Second step is then to systematically go through the investment portfolios, to look to weight them and tilt them towards greener investments, to look to take a very active stewardship role, as Larry was saying, with the companies we invest in. I'm not a believer in just exclusions from the get-go at all. I think we need to work with companies to bring about a transition, and as a result, invest significantly more. And then thirdly, I'd say from a customer perspective, I think it's really important we engage our customers on this. We did the 300 billion we invest is on behalf, for our 13 million customers. As we talk to them, 85% of them expect that we are investing that money sustainably for them, even if the fund doesn't have a sustainability label on it. So I think there's more we can do to leverage that and leverage the demand side.
Larry, I just want to come back to you, and I want to get out to Greg in just a moment, but picking up on Andy's point, he seems to echo your thoughts about how it's not about exclusion, it's not about drawing hard lines around the companies that you're willing to invest in, but you're here, at COP26, there are protesters outside protesting what's happening inside. BlackRock has also faced criticism from both the left and the right on your own ESG strategy. So how do you communicate with not only your own shareholders, but the public about what you're doing and that it is the right approach?
Well, you're right. We are being attacked from the far left and the far right. And yet our voice with our investors has never been louder. And our growth has confirmed that connections that we're having with more clients worldwide than ever before. We have to remind both the left and the right, and we have to remind everybody, this is not our money. 100% of the money that we manage is on behalf of asset owners. So our job is to give them the knowledge of choice. We are developing many, many sustainable strategies. We actually have raised about $400 million in sustainable strategies. We estimate there's $4 trillion of money that has moved into sustainability. So we represent about 10% of that strategy already. But it is up to the investors to determine where they want to place their money. If they want to be in a regular liability, an S&P or an MSCI or any liability, it is their choice. Now, what we're trying to show them through data and analytics that we're investing in, why we believe in the long term investing in more sustainable indexes and liabilities, investing in these type of strategies, will be the proper fiduciary strategy. So everything we are doing is in the minds of our asset owners, and our job is to rapidly educate them and have moving forward. So I don't believe there's any other firm doing as much as we are in finance. And that's why we have the far right pushing us, because they think we're doing too much. And I do understand the far left's views too, that time is running out, and yet it is not our. We're a fiduciary to the owners of capital, and our job is to try to educate them and move that, and we are rapidly doing that and building that. But it's not going to happen overnight, and once again, it's their decision. We are also working with the index players and saying, okay, how can you create better indexes, better liabilities? So more and more of the asset owners saying, I want to be in that index, or I want to be based on that. All of this takes time. But if we only focus on a BlackRock with our holdings of public companies, and we don't focus on the private sector, we are going to see the largest capital market arbitrage in our lifetimes, and it's beginning with a U.S.-based newspaper identified that there's more movement away from hydrocarbon assets into private hands than any time ever. That is not changing the net zero world. That's window dressing. That's greenwashing. And so we need a much better holistic solution of trying to navigate all this. We're doing our part. I think we're doing our part as well as anybody, if not better than anybody. And we are going to continue, and this is my pledge to everybody, that we're going to be moving people forward. But I can't, if I'm going to be a fiduciary, which I commit to everybody, every moment that we have to work with our owners of the capital to move them forward.
Larry, thank you for your take on that. Let me bring in Greg now, who's been waiting patiently. Greg, I'm keen to talk about how climate change is influencing your business. Climate change, increasingly extreme weather events have caused a surge in natural disasters. How is that impacting your business, the insurance industry more broadly, and how well do you think that the insurance industry can price climate risk?
Well, Julianna, a pleasure to listen to the panel, Lord Mayor, Larry, and everyone. I think what you're hearing across the board is the idea of momentum, opportunity, and a new standard on public-private. Absolutely has to happen across the globe. It can't be one sector, one aspect. It's got to be the entire marketplace. And I think that to answer your question, Julianna, you have to start a little bit with the situation. We think about climate change. We've thought about it from a distance. It's no longer there. It's at our doorstep, and it's causing a level of economic volatility which is beyond unprecedented. You think about, since the turn of the century, 6,200 discrete events have caused close to $5 trillion plus in economic loss. A fraction of that, a little over $1 trillion is insured, and that gap is really only growing. And you asked about insurance. From an insurance industry standpoint, I'll tell you, in our 300 years, that level of economic volatility has never existed before. So you think about it, even last year alone, it's $270 billion plus, and only a fraction again is insured. And so from that standpoint, and reflecting on where the panel has been, you really do have to identify, we're talking about not just one issue here. This just isn't climate on one front. This is, at least two the panel has highlighted. Of course, we're talking about what types of steps do you take to mitigate risk, to reinforce action, to get to zero carbon. Without that energy, the movement Larry's describing just doesn't happen. We've got to focus on that new investment. But the facts I just gave you suggest we've got a serious resilience and volatility issue that's in the here and now. When you think about the developing countries, that level of economic volatility is real, and we've got to address it. And we got to address both. It's both the future investment as well as the resilience in the here and now. And as the panel has highlighted, this is a government issue, this is a private issue, this is a new standard, and really public-private as it works together. And if we must create the conditions that draw capital in, or we can't really grease the skids. The momentum we've alluded to doesn't pick up. And last point I want to make, Julianna, is with data, analytics, content, insight, we have proven the concept. We can do this. This is not conceptual. We've matched capital with risk in countries like Mexico, Peru, Chile, Colombia, Jamaica. We've helped them recover from earthquakes and floods in ways they never could have before, bringing in private capital. That means the investment was not just coming in, it was coming in a way in which, when a school's rebuilt or roads rebuilt, it's done in a way that it's climate resilient. And so what I think you're hearing from the panel, this idea of momentum is proven. We can do this, but we don't have nearly enough, not even scratching the surface and bringing in the level of momentum we need to accomplish what the panel and we're talking about here. But it's really on both fronts, both on the future investment as well as on how the here and now and the resilience we've got to address in the developing countries. But we can do it, and we've proven we've made progress in it.
Jose, let me come back to you and ask about Article 6 negotiations, which are one of the key focal points of the COP26 summit. And how would agreement on carbon pricing, you think, affect capital markets behavior and activity?
Well, Larry has already talked about carbon pricing. I think that, the underlying logic, of course, is this is something that should correct a fundamental externality that we have and provide the right behavioral incentives for much needed adaptation. Then there is the subsequent issue of whether this falls on supply or falls on demand, and ultimately how this is reflected into prices and quantities. But I think that the private sector can also make a contribution on the carbon pricing. And I just want to bring up here the task force on scaling voluntary carbon markets that Mark Carney launched, and that is actually chaired by my CEO, Bill Winters. And by establishing a market where carbon credits can be traded, carbon credits of quality, in a deep and liquid markets, through the price discovery process, you're going to arrive at market prices for carbon credits, which I think are going to be very important, again, in aligning the right behavioral incentives of companies. So I think this is very, very critical. But for those markets which are no substitute for the reduction of emissions which are needed, but a financial complement to those, if those markets are to scale up, you need to have some recognition for the companies which are using these carbon credits in their net zero transitions, the recognition which is not granted now. So I think that serious consideration should be given to that, as I said, as a complement, not as a substitute for cutting emissions. And that is also something which is going to allow a lot of money to flow into climate positive and nature positive projects relating to carbon credits. And again, this is going to be a vehicle for the transfer of resources from advanced economies to emerging markets and developing economies, which I think would be very important for the world, because these emerging markets and developing economies are natural producers of whatever can be behind these carbon credits. So I think that that would be a win-win, and we should seriously think about that.
Alison, what do you think would be the most important thing that policymakers, regulators could do to unlock private capital and get it flowing to the parts of the economy, the parts of the world that need it?
Well, in a large part, we've talked about the fact we know that the money is there and getting it flowing is really important. And I think one of the things that GFANZ has done is has put together a playbook, a global playbook in terms of what is needed, which will give, integrity of, it ensures integrity, it sets out best practices, and it creates that transparency and ambition. And I think, an important part, there are 5 aspects of that, but, having clear targets, the net zero targets, clear ways of getting the money to the developing economies, so real incentives in place as well, and making sure that the regulatory architecture, we talked a little bit, David talked about, the taxonomy that is so difficult and misaligned, but getting that sort of regulatory architecture in place is really key. And so I think, that global playbook and best practices are clear ways of doing that. And I think there are some very, very simple things that we can do. One of the things that we've been working on, and David and I have been working on as part of the GFANZ group, is how do you decarbonize sectors, and set out really clear best practice so that, companies have a very clear idea of what a credible transition plan is. So they're committed to the net zero target, but this would be a credible transition plan that finance would understand and recognize and would unlock, and that will make the money flow. So I think sort of the work of GFANZ has shown shown the money is there. You know, there's real collaboration. There's a series of targets and best practice, and that, I think, is very simply how we will unlock the finance and make sure it's flowing into the developing world, as well as a consistency and integrity. And I think that will really drive the ambition to go forward.
Well, absolutely.
So I can completely agree. And so 2 specifics I would say we're looking for from government and policymakers. One is exactly that point about this end-to-end sort of stable market environment. In the UK, we've made fantastic progress on offshore wind. The cost has gone down from £150 per megawatt hour down to £40. There's substantial capital flowing. So we've got examples where this works, but you know, we're not going to end up decarbonising the UK housing stock by a provider like ourselves going to individual householders and offering to lend the money to do it. It needs some coordination around it. And then the second element is regulatory change. The current insurance Solvency II capital regime basically is based on lots of historical data, and it's a very long lead time to get anything agreed. So it's far easier for us to invest in a coal mine than a wind farm, and that cannot be right. We've got to change that so we can have a much more real-time perspective look forward at how we can invest, because if we don't know the capital treatment of an investment, we can't make the investment. So those are the 2 specifics I would draw out.
You need that clarity. Excellent practical example. I'm conscious of time, and I want to just bring it back to Larry to wrap things up. Larry, you made the comment that time is running out, and you, as you know, the head of the world's largest asset manager, it can't all fall on the shoulders of asset managers. What do you hope is achieved over the next 2 weeks here in Glasgow?
Well, it can. It won't work, but it can. We have to be open-minded about what it's going to take. We're going to have to be brutally honest about beyond just the window dressing of big commitments. We need to be focused on how to build a plan with granularity and continuity beyond these 2 weeks, and have a platform of plans of having the public-private world working together to come up with solutions. It is going to require an enormous amount of investing in the emerging world. It is going to require an enormous amount of public and private investing in new technologies. To get to a decarbonized world that is fair and just, it is going to require some incredible breakthroughs in technology that we don't have yet. And we have to admit that. And so let's dedicate a lot of quite a bit of attention to the investing, and so we could rapidly get to green hydrogen, that we could change the footprint of agriculture, that we as consumers, we all change our preferences and patterns, that we do things differently. We can get there. If the world wants to get there. We've proven it in a rapid discovery of a COVID vaccination. Capitalism works, and capitalism works with good public policy. And hopefully we use just the most recent example where public policy and capitalism works. Let's do it again, but let's do it even bigger.
All right. Well, an excellent note to end on. A huge thank you to all of you for your time today. I will just run through who we've just been joined by. Larry Fink, of course, Lord Mayor. We've also got Jose Viñals, Greg Case, Alison Rose, Andy Briggs, and David Schwimmer. So a huge thank you to all of you. And a thank you from me, Julianna Tatelbaum at CNBC. This has been a GHS at COP26 event, and we will see you around soon.
Our window to act is finite and closing quickly.
When it comes to climate change, we have a responsibility far beyond our physical borders.
For the battle for the future will not just be with COVID-19, but with the impacts of climate change.
Their focus should be on bearing the risks that the private sector cannot bear and leveraging private capital.
Financial markets and institutions can provide powerful and complementary impetus for change,
which has showcased the importance of unblocking barriers to nature-positive investment opportunities so we can accelerate the mobilization of capital into a nature-positive economy.
current pandemic has brought unimaginable devastation to people's lives, livelihoods, and national economies. At the same time, the green recovery represents an unprecedented opportunity to rethink and reset the ways in which we live and do business.
Private finance has an important role to play in that work, especially in emerging markets.
The destination is clear. Our job is to reach it in time and under budget.